There is one thing that the Church never wanted you to know, not because it is blasphemy, not because it is dangerous for your soul, but because it is dangerous for the power of those who, for more than 2,000 years, have built an entire empire on your ignorance about it. The Bible was written by men, not inspired by men, not transmitted through men, written, constructed, edited, cut, reassembled, translated, and distorted by human beings with human interests, with fears, ambitions, political rivalries, and a desperate need for control over other human beings. For centuries, anyone who said this out loud died, not metaphorically, with real fire, with bonfires raised in public squares, with human flesh burning while crowds watched in forced silence, with ashes scattered by the wind as a permanent warning, thus far and no further. But at some point in the second half of the 17th century, in a small, cold room in Amsterdam, a man lit a candle and began to write. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that every line put on paper was a sentence against himself. He had already been expelled from his own community. He had been cursed by his own. The excommunication he received was not common. It was the most severe ever pronounced in the history of the Amsterdam synagogue. The words of the herem, the ban, echoed as if they had been written with divine wrath. No one shall communicate with him orally or in writing, nor do him any favor, nor dwell under the same roof as him, nor approach him within 4 cubits. And yet Baruch Spinoza wrote, he polished lenses during the day to pay the rent. He breathed glass dust that slowly destroyed his lungs. He lived alone, with few friends, without fortune, without glory in life. He refused a chair at the University of Heidelberg because he knew that the freedom to think did not fit within any institution, and that any institution, sooner or later, would demand the price of silence. And he wrote, what came out of those pages was not just philosophy. It was an autopsy, a cold, precise, and relentless dissection of the body of organized religion, and especially of the Catholicism that had built Rome, that had built empires, that had built the very backbone of the Western world. Spinoza took the Bible and treated it as what it was, a historical document. He traced the internal contradictions, the anachronisms, the inconsistencies, the moments when the text mentions things that could not exist at the time they were supposedly written. He demonstrated that Moses could not have written the Pentateuch because the Pentateuch describes Moses' own death. He showed that the books of the prophets were compiled and edited centuries after the events they describe. He demonstrated that the narrative structure of the Bible is not that of a divine revelation. It is that of a deliberate political project, a project to create a people, to unify scattered tribes around a common identity, to place in the hands of a priestly caste the absolute power to define what was sacred and what was profane, and therefore what was permitted and what deserved punishment. And Spinoza went beyond that. Because if the structure of biblical Judaism was political before it was spiritual, Catholicism was the expanded, refined, and universalized version of that same mechanism, an institution that took that original project, watered it with the blood of a Galilean carpenter, wrapped it in gold and incense, and transformed it into the greatest structure of domination that the Western world has ever known, not just spiritual, political, economic, military, an architecture of obedience so sophisticated that people not only obeyed, they thanked for being able to obey. That is the core of what Spinoza revealed. And here is the detail that no one tells properly. He did not do this out of hatred. Spinoza was not a destroyer of faith. He was perhaps the philosopher who most deeply believed in something divine in the history of modern thought. But that something did not fit in any church. It did not obey any pope. It did not need any priest as an intermediary between the human being and the sacred. For Spinoza, God and nature were the same thing. Deus sive natura. God, that is, nature. An equation that today sounds almost poetic, but that in the 17th century was a philosophical bomb, the death sentence of an entire system of social, political, and spiritual control built over 2 millennia. In this video, we will delve deep into the Theological Political Treatise, the book that Spinoza published anonymously in 1670, and that was immediately banned, burned, and included in the list of the most dangerous texts ever written in the history of Western civilization. We will enter the letters he exchanged with the greatest thinkers of his time. We will enter the mind of a man who, alone, with a candle and a pen, dismantled the foundation upon which 2 millennia of ecclesiastical power were erected. At the end of this journey, you will not see religion the same way, not because this video intends to destroy anyone's faith. Spinoza had a profound faith, a faith that he defended with a courage that few human beings have demonstrated at any time. But you will understand, as he understood, that there is an abyssal distance between the divine and the institutions that claim to speak in the name of the divine, a distance that cost lives, that cost centuries of imprisoned thought, that still today, in ways that often go unnoticed, continues to cost the freedom to think. Take a deep breath, because now the story begins. Amsterdam, 1632. The city smelled of spices and money. The port never slept. Ships arrived loaded with pepper, cinnamon, oriental fabrics, slaves, gold. Ships departed loaded with cheese, tulips, ink, paper, and ideas, especially ideas, which in that particular century were a commodity as valuable and as dangerous as any other crossing the Atlantic. The Republic of the United Provinces of the Netherlands was, at that moment, the richest nation in the world. And also, what is less obvious but equally true, the freest. Not completely free, as complete freedom is an illusion at any time, but compared to the rest of Europe, where the Inquisition still burned bodies and censorship crushed printing presses with the same ease with which it crushed skulls, Amsterdam was something extraordinary, a place where certain things could be thought, where certain things could, with care, be written. It was in this city that Baruch Spinoza was born on November 24, 1632. His parents were Sephardic Jews, descendants of the Jews expelled from Spain in 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella, newly unified on the throne of Castile and Aragon, decided that religious purity was more important than the economic prosperity that the Jews brought to their kingdoms. The expulsion was one of the greatest demographic catastrophes of the Iberian Peninsula. More than 100,000 people left their homes, their businesses, their cemeteries, their synagogues. They took with them memories of generations, mixed languages, culinary recipes, and a wound that would never fully heal. Some went to North Africa, others to the Ottoman Empire, where the Sultan welcomed them with sharp irony, noting that Ferdinand of Spain was a mad king who impoverished his own kingdom by expelling the most productive men he had. Others later made their way to the Netherlands, where the new mercantile republic needed capital, trade networks, experience, and had enough flexibility to ignore the religion of those who brought these things. The Jewish community of Amsterdam that welcomed Spinoza's ancestors was therefore a community of survivors, of people who had learned, in the flesh and blood of their grandparents, what happened when religion became an instrument of the state, who had lived on the fringes often disguised as Christians while secretly maintaining their practices, their rituals, their identity, who carried with them the permanent memory that difference could be fatal, and who, upon arriving in Amsterdam and finally being able to practice their faith openly, built a rigid, defensive, closed community, because communities that have survived on the edge of a knife do not indulge in the luxury of openness. Michael de Spinoza, Baruch's father, was a merchant, a man of good standing within the community, respected, involved with the institutions of the synagogue. Baruch was raised in this environment of study, debate, and a millennia-old intellectual tradition that deeply valued the written word, the Torah, the Talmud, the commentaries of the great rabbis, the endless discussions about the law. From childhood, Spinoza learned Hebrew, Aramaic, studied the sacred texts with the seriousness that tradition demanded. But there was something in him that did not conform to the limits of what could be thought. The school where he studied, Cato Torah, was one of the best educational institutions that the Jewish community of Amsterdam maintained. Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera was one of the teachers, a man of impressive erudition, a rigorous defender of orthodoxy, who would later become one of the signatories of the excommunication of own student. Spinoza also came into contact with the ideas of medieval philosophers such as Maimonides and Crescus, and with the more modern thought circulating in Amsterdam, Descartes, in particular, who had transformed the way Europeans thought about knowledge, certainty, and the foundations of reason. Descartes had launched an idea that seemed simple but was revolutionary, that the starting point of true knowledge could not be authority, neither that of a sacred book, nor of a priest, nor of a king, but individual reason, that each human being had the capacity, through rigorous thought, to arrive at the truth by themselves. For a mind like Spinoza's, this was not an inspiration, it was a liberation, because if reason was the criterion of truth, then everything was subject to the examination of reason, geometry, physics, metaphysics, and also, why not, religious texts, the Torah, the Gospels, the letters of Paul, papal bulls, the councils, the entire immense documentary edifice upon which organized religion had built its authority. Everything could be examined. And when Spinoza began to examine, what he found was not what should have been there. The details of his life during the period between adolescence and excommunication are incomplete. It is known that his father died in 1654, leaving him and his brother Gabriel in charge of the family's business affairs, which soon fell into difficulties. It is known that Spinoza began to attend intellectual circles outside the Jewish community, study groups, informal academies, the so-called collegiants, non-dogmatic Christians who gathered to debate the Bible without the mediation of an institutional church. It is known that his thought gradually distanced itself from the orthodoxy he had absorbed in childhood. What is not known for certain is what exactly provoked the synagogue's decision to pronounce against him the most severe of possible banishments. The herem pronounced against Baruch Spinoza on July 27, 1656, is an extraordinary document, not for what it says, but for what it does not say. Contrary to what would be expected, the text does not specify any concrete heresy. It does not cite any specific idea that Spinoza would have expressed. It only speaks in vague and emotionally charged terms of abominable heresies and monstrous works, of terrible behaviors and communications with people outside the community. Historians have debated for centuries what really happened. Some theories suggest that Spinoza had begun to openly express his doubts about the divine origin of the Torah. Others indicate financial conflicts with members of the community. Some suggest that the Jewish community of Amsterdam, always careful with its image before the Dutch authorities, feared that Spinoza's ideas would compromise the tolerance they enjoyed, that a declaredly heterodox Jew would give the intolerant the ammunition they needed to attack the entire community. What is certain is that the herem was pronounced, and that Spinoza did not retract. He did not try to negotiate. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not moderate his own ideas to regain the community's acceptance. On the contrary, the excommunication seems to have functioned as a kind of liberation for him, as if the thread that still bound him to the need for community approval had been cut, and he could finally think without the weight of that collective gaze on his shoulders. He adopted the Latin name Benedictus. Baruch and Benedictus mean the same thing, blessed word in Hebrew and Latin respectively, and began to build his life outside the walls of the community that had rejected him. He moved to the outskirts of Amsterdam, then to Rijnsburg, then to Voorburg, and finally to The Hague, where he would live the rest of his short life. He polished lenses, a technical, relatively solitary craft that provided him with enough sustenance without requiring him to submit to any institution. He corresponded with philosophers, scientists, and theologians from all over Europe. He received visitors who traveled long distances to talk with him for a few hours, and he wrote, with a patience and precision that were in themselves a form of devotion. The world that Spinoza inhabited was a world at war with itself. 17th-century Europe was slowly and painfully emerging from an era in which religion controlled every aspect of public and private life. The 30 Years' War, which had only ended in 1648, 8 years before Spinoza's excommunication, had destroyed a third of the population of Germany. It had left entire cities in ashes. It had killed between 8 and 12 million people, largely in the name of disputes between Catholics and Protestants over the exact nature of Christ's presence in the sacrament of the Eucharist. 8 million dead over a theological question about bread and wine. If that did not demonstrate that something was profoundly wrong in the relationship between religion and power, Spinoza did not know what else could, and it was this perception, not only philosophical, but visceral, historical, fueled by the memory of what organized religion had done to his own people centuries before, that was at the root of everything he wrote. The Theological Political Treatise, which he probably began writing in the second half of the 1660s, was not an academic exercise. It was an intervention. It was a text written with urgency, with the awareness that the ideas contained within it were necessary, not only for philosophy, but for the survival of a civilization that continued to destroy itself in the name of books that no one had really read with open eyes. Spinoza opened those eyes, and what he saw changed everything. In 1670, a book appeared on the shelves of Amsterdam's bookstores. The title page stated that it had been published in Hamburg by a publisher named Henricum Kunrat. Both pieces of information were false, a deliberate precaution to protect the author and the true publisher from the consequences that would surely follow. The author's name appeared nowhere. It was an anonymous book, and its anonymity was a necessary armor. The title was Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, Theological Political Treatise. The subtitle was even more explicit about what was to come, containing some dissertations in which it is shown that the freedom to philosophize can not only be granted without prejudice to piety and the peace of the state, but also cannot be abolished without simultaneously destroying both the peace of the state and piety itself. The European intellectual community quickly identified the author. Spinoza's letters had been circulating for years among philosophers and scientists. His style was recognizable, that geometric clarity, that total absence of rhetorical ornamentation, that willingness to get straight to the most uncomfortable point without deviation. Within months, everyone knew who had written the book, and the reaction was immediate. The Amsterdam Synod condemned the text in 1670, the same year of its publication. The States of Holland attempted to formally ban it in 1674. The theologian Jacob Thomasius called it the most pestilent book ever published. The philosopher Leibniz, who had asked a friend for a copy of the book and who secretly admired much of what Spinoza had written, publicly distanced himself from the work because being associated with it was politically suicidal. In 1679, the treatise was placed on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of books prohibited by the Catholic Church. What was in those pages that provoked such a reaction? To understand this, one must understand what 17th century Europe believed about the Bible. The official position of all Christian churches, Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist, Anglican, in all their variations, was that the Bible was the Word of God. Not a word inspired by God and transmitted through fallible human beings, with all the distortions that such transmission would imply. The direct, immediate Word of God, without mediation. The texts of the Old Testament had been written by the prophets and patriarchs under divine dictation. The Gospels had been written by the apostles or by their direct disciples, with the assistance of the Holy Spirit. Paul's letters were communications from someone who had had a personal revelation of the risen Christ. The authority of the church, of any church, depended on this belief. Because if the Bible was the Word of God, then whoever interpreted it correctly had divine authority. Whoever interpreted it incorrectly was in heresy. And the definition of what constituted correct or incorrect interpretation belonged naturally to the institution, to the Pope, to the Synod, to the Consistory, to the Council of Bishops. The Bible as divine word was the foundation of the entire structure of religious power. Without it, the edifice crumbles. Spinoza reached this foundation and examined it. With the same precision he applied to polishing lenses, each surface checked, each imperfection identified, each deviation measured. He examined the biblical texts as historical documents, and what he found was devastating. He began with the most basic, the authorship of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which Jewish and Christian tradition attributed to Moses. Moses did not write the Pentateuch. This Spinoza demonstrated not with speculation or theological arguments, but with the text itself. Deuteronomy 34 describes the death of Moses. It describes his burial in a valley, but to this day no one knows where his grave is. It describes how there has never been in Israel a prophet like Moses. The phrase "to this day" implies a narrator looking back at the past, a narrator who lived long enough after Moses for the location of the grave to be unknown, for there to have been time to establish a comparison with other prophets who came later. Moses could not have written the description of his own death. This alone would not be a conclusive argument for a determined theologian. It could be dismissed as a later addition to the original text. But Spinoza did not stop there. He went through the entire text and identified dozens of anachronisms, references to places with names that those places did not yet have at the time of Moses, mentions of practices and institutions that would only exist centuries later, third-person observations that no author would write about themselves. In Genesis 12:6, there is the phrase, "At that time the Canaanites were in the land." This phrase only makes sense if written by someone for whom the Canaanites no longer inhabited the land, that is, after Israel's conquest of Canaan, which according to the biblical narrative itself happened centuries after Moses. In Genesis 36, there is a list of kings of Edom who reigned before any king reigned over the Israelites, a reference that would only make sense after the establishment of the Israelite monarchy, more than 400 years after Moses. The conclusion was inevitable. The Pentateuch was written, or at least compiled and edited in its current form, long after the events it describes, by someone or by several someones who were looking back at the past and constructing a narrative of origins. But for what purpose? Before continuing, you are here, and that is no small thing. Most people get to the title of a video like this, feel a slight discomfort, and close the tab. You stayed. You are reading about a man who was banished, isolated, and chose the truth anyway. And that says something about who you are. Some people come to the comments and write, "I didn't know the Bible had these internal contradictions. Can someone explain more?" Others write, "I studied theology for years and never learned this." And there are those who write, "This changed the way I see everything." If anything in this video touched something inside you, write in the comments. It doesn't have to be a thesis, a word is enough. Because when you write, you become part of a conversation that started 350 years ago in a cold room in Amsterdam, with a lit candle and a quill in hand. And if you want to continue down this path, subscribe to the channel now. Because what comes next about how the Catholic Church was built on these same foundations that Spinoza dismantled is the kind of thing that changes how you read the entire history of the Western world. Back to the text, Spinoza identified not only that the Pentateuch was written after Moses, he identified by whom, or by what type of agent. The Dutch philosopher was a careful reader of a certain medieval Jewish scholar named Ibn Ezra, who had left discreet, almost enigmatic comments on some passages of the Pentateuch, comments that suggested, without stating openly, that Moses could not have written certain sections. Spinoza took these comments and reached the conclusion that Ibn Ezra had not dared to draw. The Pentateuch was almost certainly compiled by Ezra, the priest who led the return of the Jews from Babylonian exile in the 5th century BCE. Ezra, according to the very book that bears his name, found the book of the law and read it publicly to the people, who apparently had forgotten or never knew the laws contained within it. This narrative, read by Spinoza with the eyes of someone analyzing a historical document, suggested not a reunion with an ancient law, but the presentation of a new law, or significantly reconstituted, as if it were ancient. In other words, an ideological foundation for a community that needed to rebuild itself after the trauma of exile. This was crucial, because Spinoza was pointing to something that goes far beyond a question of literary authorship. He was pointing to the central mechanism by which religions construct their authority. The presentation of the present as past, the human as divine, the constructed as revealed. A law that you write today and present to the people as having been received from God by a patriarch who lived centuries ago is infinitely more powerful than a law that you simply decree. Because the former cannot be questioned, it cannot be revoked, it cannot be negotiated. It comes from outside history, from a place beyond human reach, and therefore is beyond any human criticism. It is a perfect power structure, and Spinoza was the first to describe it with such clarity. But what did he do with the prophets? with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the most dramatic and emotionally powerful voices of the entire Hebrew Bible? Spinoza did not deny that the prophets had intense experiences. He did not deny that they felt something they interpreted as contact with the divine. What he did was something more sophisticated. He examined the nature of those experiences and concluded that they were imaginative, not intellectual. The prophets, according to Spinoza, had extraordinarily vivid imaginations, not superior intellects. They saw visions, they heard voices, they experienced altered states of consciousness that they interpreted as revelation. But here is the point. The messages they brought, the moral and political structure of their pronouncements, consistently reflected the problems, alliances, and political conflicts of their own time. Isaiah wrote about the Assyrian threat because Assyria was the dominant power of his time. Jeremiah wrote about Babylon because Babylon was at the door. The prophecies did not transcend history. They were deeply rooted in it. They were political readings of contemporary reality, cloaked in the language of the supernatural so that they would have enough weight to move crowds. Prophecy was political dressed in divine garb. And when you understand this, you begin to see the entire Old Testament in a different light, not as a narrative of progressive revelation from a God who becomes closer to humanity, but as the historical archive of a nation in formation, of a people who were building their identity, their law, their power structure, and who used the language of the divine, because the language of the divine was, in that context, the only language strong enough to make people obey. And this led directly to the question that Spinoza had not yet confronted head-on, but which was implicit on every page of the treatise. If biblical Judaism was, in its fundamental structure, a political project as much as a spiritual one, what about Catholicism, which took that project, universalized it, expanded it across entire continents, armed it with armies and inquisitorial courts? That answer would come, and when it did, it would be even more disturbing. To understand what Spinoza revealed about the origins of Catholicism, one must first understand what Catholicism claims about itself. The official narrative is clean, linear, and powerful in its simplicity. Jesus of Nazareth, the incarnate Son of God, was born of a virgin in Roman Judea, lived among the poor, preached love and forgiveness, was crucified by the authorities, and rose on the third day. Before ascending to heaven, he entrusted Peter, an unlettered Galilean fisherman, with the keys to the kingdom of heaven and the authority to guide his church on earth. Peter went to Rome, he founded the Church of Rome, and from Peter descends, in an unbroken line, the papal authority that governs the Catholic Church to this day. This is the narrative. Spinoza did not need to refute it directly, although the Theological Political Treatise contained enough tools to do so. What he did was something slower and more effective. He established a method, a way of reading religious texts that, once learned, makes it impossible to accept origin narratives without examining them with the same criteria that would apply to any other historical document. And when this method is applied to the origins of Catholicism, what emerges is not the story the Church tells. It is an entirely different story. Let's start with the real beginning, not with the birth of Jesus, but with what happened in the decades and centuries after his death. Jesus died around the year 30 of the Common Era. He left no written text, not a single line that can be historically attributed to him. What we have are texts written about him, the Gospels, which were composed between approximately 40 and 90 years after his death. The oldest, the Gospel of Mark, was probably written around 70 of the Common Era. The latest, that of John, probably between 90 and 100. This means that between the death of Jesus and the writing of the oldest document we have about him, there passed 40 years. 40 years of oral tradition, of dispersed communities spreading stories, of community leaders shaping narratives to meet the needs of their own groups, of internal tensions among different factions of the nascent movement, those who believed that Jesus had simply been a particularly enlightened Jewish prophet, those who believed he was the Messiah awaited by Judaism, and those who, increasingly influential, believed he was something more, the incarnation of God himself. These are theological differences that seem abstract until you realize what they imply politically. If Jesus was a Jewish prophet, then the movement that follows his teachings is an internal reform of Judaism, limited, by definition, to the Jewish people and their traditions. If he is the Jewish Messiah, the situation is already more complex, because the Jewish tradition about the Messiah includes very concrete political expectations, such as the restoration of the kingdom of David and the liberation of Israel from foreign domination, none of which had happened. But if Jesus was God incarnate, coming not only for Israel but for all humanity, and if his death and resurrection opened the way of salvation for all human beings, regardless of ethnic origin or obedience to Jewish law, then the movement becomes potentially universal, potentially imperial. This leap from Jewish reform to universal religion was not made by Jesus. It was made primarily by Paul of Tarsus. Paul is an extraordinary figure in the history of the Western world and almost incomprehensible in the terms in which the Church presents him. He was a Jew of the diaspora, born in Tarsus, in Anatolia, with Roman citizenship, a Greek speaker, educated in the rabbinic tradition, but deeply embedded in Hellenistic culture. He never personally knew Jesus. He never heard a single sermon. He was not present at the crucifixion, nor at any of the events described in the Gospels. What he had was an experience, the famous conversion on the road to Damascus, an intense visionary experience that he describes as an encounter with the risen Christ. And from that experience, he built a theology that completely transformed what the movement of Jesus had been until then. Paul was the first to clearly articulate the doctrine that would become the heart of Christianity, that Jesus' death was an atoning sacrifice, that he died for the sins of humanity, that his death erased the debt that humans had with God due to original sin, and that salvation did not depend on the fulfillment of Jewish law, but on faith in that death and resurrection. This is a huge theological shift, but it is also, and this is where Spinoza would become relevant, a change with political consequences of impossible overestimation. By disconnecting salvation from obedience to Jewish law, Paul opened the movement to the Gentiles, the non-Jews, and in doing so, he transformed a movement of internal reform of a small, oppressed nation into a potential universal religion, without ethnic boundaries, without requirements of origin, accessible to any human being who simply believed. Why was this politically explosive? Because the Roman Empire in the 1st century was a multi-ethnic domination structure that governed dozens of different peoples, with completely distinct languages, cultures, religions, and traditions. What held this immense territory cohesive was not only military force, although military force was the foundation, it was also a culture of symbolic domination. Rome not only conquered peoples, absorbed their gods, their myths, their religious practices, incorporating them into an increasingly eclectic pantheon that served to dissolve local identities into an imperial identity. A religion that promised universal salvation, that said that before God there was neither Greek nor Jew, slave nor free, man nor woman, was at the same time a threat to the Roman pantheon and an extraordinary opportunity for anyone who knew how to use it. And someone did. Constantine, the Roman emperor, promulgated the Edict of Milan in 313, granting religious freedom to all citizens of the empire, including Christians, who had been persecuted with greater or lesser intensity over the previous 2 centuries. He then convened the Council of Nicaea in 325, where bishops from all over the Christian world gathered to decide, among other things, a question that had divided the movement for decades. Was Jesus of the same substance as the Father, homoousios, or of similar substance, homoousios? One vowel, a single Greek vowel, separated the two positions. And Constantine, who was not a theologian, who had grown up in the cult of the unconquered Son, and who probably converted to Christianity for primarily political reasons, presided over the debate and ensured that the orthodox position, homoousios, same substance, Jesus is God, was adopted as official doctrine. This was not a theological accident, it was a political calculation. A religion whose founder was a human prophet, however enlightened, has limits. It can inspire devotion, create communities, and nourish an ethic. But a religion whose founder is God incarnate, the second person of a divine trinity, has power of a completely different order. because then the authority of those who speak in the name of that religion is not derived from a human tradition, however venerable it may be. It is derived from God himself. And whoever controls the definition of what that religion asserts, who decides what is heresy and what is orthodoxy, who has the power to excommunicate, to absolve, to proclaim saints, and to condemn sinners, holds a form of power that no army can completely replicate. Constantine understood this, and by embracing Christianity and promoting it as the preferred religion of the empire, he was not being driven by a genuine spiritual conversion. He was recognizing in this universal religion, with its promise of equal salvation and its hierarchical structure of bishops and councils, the perfect instrument to unify an empire that was fragmenting. Rome did not convert to Christianity. Rome converted Christianity into Rome. This is the central assertion that emerges from Spinoza's analysis, even if he did not formulate it in these exact terms, because the Theological Political Treatise primarily focuses on the texts of the Old Testament and uses the New Testament as a secondary reference. But the principles he established, that religions are historical political constructions, that their authority is derived not from divine revelation, but from human processes of power and control, that sacred texts reflect the needs and interests of the groups that produced them, apply with the same force to Catholicism as to biblical Judaism, and perhaps with more force because Catholicism had more time, more resources, and an extraordinary institutional genius to perfect what Judaism had outlined, the perfect fusion of spiritual authority and political power. Here is the dimension of this achievement, so that it is possible to understand the scale of what Spinoza was attacking. In the year 380 of the Common Era, Emperor Theodosius promulgated the Edict of Thessalonica, which made Nicene Christianity, the version approved at the Council of Nicaea, the official religion of the Roman Empire. Any other religious practice was declared heretical or pagan, and therefore subject to punishment by the state. In less than 70 years, Christianity had gone from a persecuted religion to the religion of the state, and with that, the persecution simply changed direction. Before it was Christians who were persecuted, now it was the heretics, Christians with the wrong theology, and the pagans who would be. The apparatus of violence of the Roman state, which had fed lions with Christian bodies, was now put to the service of Christian orthodoxy. It is hard to imagine a more complete transformation, and it is equally hard not to see in this transformation exactly the mechanism that Spinoza had identified in the texts of the Old Testament: religion as an instrument of political power, with the state using the sacred to legitimize coercion, and the Church using the state to impose theological obedience. The symbiosis between Rome and Catholicism was so deep that when the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed in the 5th century, the Church did not collapse with it. On the contrary, it filled the void. Bishops took on administrative functions. Monasteries became centers of knowledge preservation and local power. The Pope, Bishop of Rome, claimed an authority that transcended any emperor. And in the 8th century, when Pope Stephen II traveled north of the Alps to negotiate with the Frankish king Pepin the Short, and when, in exchange for political and military support, he crowned Pepin as king by the grace of God, the alliance between the papacy and secular power that would define European politics for centuries was sealed. The Church was no longer just a spiritual community. It was a state within states, with territory, with armies, with courts, with an administrative bureaucracy that rivaled any secular government, and with a control tool that no secular government possessed: the threat of eternal damnation for those who disobeyed. This was what Spinoza saw when looked at Catholicism, not necessarily with hatred, as has been said, but with the cold clarity of someone who has removed the distorted lens of reverence and is seeing the object as it is: a historical mechanism of power, built by human beings, serving human interests, using the language of the divine, because the language of the divine was the most effective instrument available. And the question this raised, the question that no one in 17th century Europe was willing to ask out loud except for Spinoza, was, if all of this is a human construction, if the authority of the Church does not come from God, but from Constantine, from Theodosius, from Pepin, from centuries of negotiations and manipulations and wars and councils, where men debated Greek vowels while deciding the spiritual fate of entire continents. Then what remains? What remains when you remove the gilded frame of the divine and look at what is inside? What remains is ethics. What remains is reason. What remains is what Spinoza called God sive natura, something that did not need texts written by men, priests as intermediaries, threats of hell, or promises of paradise to be real. Something that was real simply because it was. And that absolutely simple, absolutely direct thing was more threatening to the Church than any army. There is a certain irony in Spinoza. The man who most systematically dismantled the pretense of divine authority of religious texts was himself a thinker of profound and almost religious seriousness. His philosophy is not the easy skepticism of someone who dismissed the question of the divine as irrelevant. It is exactly the opposite. It is the work of someone for whom the divine was the most important question in the universe, but who refused to accept ready-made, inherited, unexamined answers. To understand what he discovered about the Bible, and by extension about the structures that were built around it, one must understand the method he developed. Because this method was not merely philosophical, it was revolutionary in a way that only became completely clear centuries later, when the principles that Spinoza had established in the Theological Political Treatise became the foundation of what is called historical biblical criticism. The academic discipline that, starting in the 19th century, completely transformed humanity's understanding of its own sacred texts. The central principle of Spinoza's method was apparently simple: the Bible must be interpreted by the Bible. This may sound like something any theologian could accept, and indeed Protestant reformers like Calvin and Luther had defended similar principles against the authority of Catholic tradition. But Spinoza took this principle to a conclusion that no reformer had dared to draw. To interpret the Bible by the Bible meant for him to treat it like any other historical text. It meant asking, who wrote this? In what context? For what purpose? For which audience? With what cultural and political assumptions? It meant not allowing a prior assumption, such as the assumption that the text is divine and therefore cannot contain contradictions, to determine how the text would be read. It was the method of innocent reading, or perhaps more precisely, of honest reading. And the honest reading of biblical texts revealed something that traditional theological readings, whether Catholic or Protestant, consistently ignored or explained away with increasingly elaborate interpretative acrobatics. The internal contradictions were numerous, persistent, and impossible to reconcile without violence to the text. Let us take an example that Spinoza did not use, but which perfectly illustrates the principle. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke present different narratives of the birth of Jesus. In Matthew, the family flees to Egypt after the birth to escape the massacre of the innocents ordered by Herod. In Luke, the family calmly goes from Bethlehem to Jerusalem to present the child in the temple and then returns to Nazareth. In Matthew, the first visitors are magi from the east. In Luke, they are shepherds. The genealogies are different. Matthew's goes from Abraham to Jesus through one lineage, while Luke's goes from Adam to Jesus through a completely different lineage, with distinct names for the same grandparents. They are the same events, described in incompatible ways by two texts that the Church insists are equally inspired by the Holy Spirit. The traditional theological explanation that the Holy Spirit may have inspired two different authors to emphasize distinct aspects of the same event is possible as a position of faith, but as a historical argument, it is unsatisfactory. And it is exactly this dissatisfaction that Spinoza's method makes articulable. Because if two texts describe the same event in contradictory ways, there are only a few possibilities. One of them is wrong, or both are wrong, or both are describing not what happened, but what needed to happen for specific theological or political purposes. Matthew, for example, has a very clear interest in showing that Jesus is the fulfillment of the prophecies of the Old Testament. The narrative of the flight into Egypt and the return is explicitly connected to a prophecy from Hosea. Out of Egypt I called my son. The massacre of the innocents echoes the story of Moses, whose birth was threatened by the Pharaoh. Jesus, in Matthew, is systematically presented as the new Moses, the new Israel, the fulfillment of everything the Old Testament had promised. Luke has a different interest. His audience is more Gentile, less connected to the Jewish tradition. His narrative emphasizes other elements: the humility of the shepherds, the singing of the angels, the presentation in the temple as fulfillment of Jewish law. Jesus, in Luke, is the universal Savior. Two texts, two audiences, two distinct theological and political purposes, two incompatible versions of the same events. This is not an accusation of falsehood, at least not necessarily. It is an observation about the nature of religious texts. They are written by human beings for other human beings, with specific human purposes, within specific historical contexts. They are not neutral transmissions of objective facts. They are narratives shaped by intentions. Spinoza was sophisticated enough to understand that this did not render the texts worthless. It made them historically valuable, as documents of the beliefs, hopes, fears, and political strategies of the communities that produced them. But it completely destroyed their pretense of being an irrefutable authority on eternal truths. And it was this pretense, the pretense of irrefutable authority, that the entire power structure of the Church depended on. Here it is necessary to pause for a moment and understand exactly what was at stake, because it is easy to underestimate it from the perspective of the 21st century. For a 17th century European, the authority of the Church was not just a religious matter in the modern and limited sense of the word. It was the foundation of the entire social order. The hierarchy was divine, not just metaphorically, but literally. The king ruled because God had chosen him and the Church had anointed him. The feudal lord had authority over the peasants because God had established social hierarchies. The priest had authority over the faithful because Christ had given Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and from Peter, the authority had descended in an unbroken line to the most humble village pastor. Questioning the authority of the Bible was not just a theological issue. It was questioning the foundation of the entire political and social organization of Europe. It was opening the most dangerous Pandora's box that a 17th century mind could imagine, and Spinoza opened that box. But, and this is the point that his enemies never understood or never wanted to understand, he did not open it to create chaos. He opened it to replace a false foundation with a true foundation, because if authority cannot come from texts written by men and fraudulently presented as divine, where can it come from? From reason, Spinoza said, from reason understood not as the cold and calculating instrument that later modernity would turn into mere technical rationality, but as something closer to what the Greeks called logos, the human capacity to understand the immanent order of the universe, to perceive the necessary connections between things, to act from a clear understanding of reality rather than from fear, superstition, or obedience to external authorities. Spinoza was a rationalist in the deepest sense of the word, not because he believed that reason could answer all questions, but because he believed that questions answered outside of reason, by definition, were not truly answered. They were suppressed. And the suppression of questions, the prohibition of examining, questioning, doubting, was exactly the mechanism by which power perpetuated itself. The Church had intuitively understood this since its earliest centuries. The list of forbidden ideas, of questions that could not be raised, of texts that could not be read, was immensely revealing. Not of what was spiritually dangerous, but of what was politically dangerous. The doctrine of papal infallibility was politically dangerous to question because it weakened the authority of the representative, maximum of the institution. The doctrine of transubstantiation was politically dangerous to question because it was the foundation of the priest's power, the only one capable of performing the miracle of the Mass. The historicity of the biblical narratives was politically dangerous to question because it weakened the entire chain of authority that depended on these narratives for its legitimization. Spinoza did not directly attack these doctrines in general. He did something more effective. He attacked the methodological principle by which they were protected from analysis. He showed that the appeal to the divine authority of the texts as a response to any questioning was circular. It presupposed as proven exactly what needed to be demonstrated. And once this methodological principle was overturned, the entire doctrinal edifice was exposed to the type of analysis that the Church had spent centuries prohibiting. But there was more. Because Spinoza was not just attacking the intellectual authority of the Church, he was attacking its motivational structure, the system of rewards and punishments, of heaven and hell, of grace and damnation, by which obedience was guaranteed. For Spinoza, religion based on fear, fear of damnation, fear of excommunication, fear of divine punishment, was not genuine religion. It was manipulation, a system of control that used human ignorance about death and the afterlife as leverage to ensure obedience in the present. The true divine, that thing Spinoza called God or nature or infinite substance, did not threaten. It did not punish. It did not require sacrifices, did not need intermediaries, did not manifest in miracles that violated natural laws. It was natural law. It was the immanent order of the universe, present in everything, expressing itself in everything, no more located in a church or a sacred text than in a stone, a leaf, a mathematical equation. And the human being who understood this, who understood themselves as part of something infinitely greater, not in servitude but in participation, was free in a way that the believer terrified by damnation could never be. This was Spinoza's real theology, not atheism, the most common accusation from his contemporaries, not nihilistic skepticism, but a form of contemplative and deeply serious ethical life that simply did not need institutional mediation to be lived. And that is exactly what made it unacceptable to the Church, because a spirituality that does not need the Church is a spirituality that does not generate revenue, does not generate obedience, does not generate power. It is a free spirituality, and freedom, as Spinoza knew better than almost anyone, is the most dangerous thing there is for those who build their power on the other's need to be guided. There is a pattern in the religious texts of all cultures that Spinoza was the first to systematically describe, and once seen, it cannot be unspoken. The pattern is this: the supernatural always appears without exception, at the exact moment when the human power of a figure or institution needs to be legitimized. Not before, not after. At the precise moment when an argument of authority is necessary, does Moses need to convince the Israelites that he is speaking in God's name? The plagues arrive. Does he need to ensure that the law he is going to present to the people is obeyed? He goes to Mount Sinai and returns with tablets written by the divine finger itself. Is his leadership challenged by Korah and his followers? The earth opens and swallows them. Do the prophets need to be recognized as voices of God against kings who do not want to listen to them? They perform miracles. They make it rain after years of drought. They resurrect the dead. They predict battles with supernatural precision. Does Jesus need to establish his authority over the scribes and Pharisees? He heals paralytics, casts out demons, turns water into wine. Does he need to confirm his divine identity after death? He resurrects, appears to the disciples, ascends to heaven before witnesses. The pattern is perfectly consistent. The miracle is not a random eruption of the supernatural into history. It is a narrative tool, a device that the authors of the texts used, consciously or unconsciously, to solve the most fundamental problem that any system of authority faces. Why should I obey you? The answer that the miracle provides is brutally simple: because God is on my side. And you know that God is on my side because something happened that cannot be explained by the normal laws of nature. Therefore, questioning my authority is questioning God. And questioning God is heresy. Spinoza attacked this structure from two different angles, one theological and one philosophical, and both reached the same conclusion. The theological angle was this: the very idea of a miracle implies a contradiction with any sophisticated notion of God. If God is the first cause of all things, if he created the universe with its laws and order, if he is omniscient and therefore knew from eternity all the events that would occur, then a miracle, a violation of natural laws, would be an internal contradiction within God himself. It would be God contradicting his own work. It would be God changing his mind. It would be a God who creates an ordered universe and then needs to intervene to correct what he created, which implies either that the original creation was incomplete, or that God is not omniscient, or that the miracle is simply a human fiction projected onto natural events that were not understood. Spinoza chose, with philosophical rigor, the third option. Miracles, he argued, are not violations of natural laws. They are natural events that contemporaries did not understand, or events that were narrated in a supernatural way because the narrator needed them to be supernatural. The distinction is crucial. It is not about denying that dramatic events occurred in the history of Israel, in the ministry of Jesus, or in any other religious tradition. It is about asserting that the supernatural interpretation of these events is a cultural construction, not an objective observation, and that this cultural construction serves very specific political purposes. The philosophical angle was even more direct. Spinoza's God sive natura, God as nature, could not perform miracles because he was not a being separate from nature who could intervene in it. He was nature. He was the set of all the laws that govern existence. He was the fabric of reality, not a separate intelligence operating on that fabric from the outside. For Spinoza, calling something a miracle was simply confessing ignorance, confessing that one did not know the natural cause of the event in question, and using this ignorance as the basis for a claim of divine authority was, in philosophical terms, building an argument on a whole. The more knowledge advances and the whole of ignorance diminishes, the more fragile the foundation becomes. The history of the relationship between science and religion in the Western world is, to a large extent, the history of this whole diminishing, and of religious institutions trying to defend, meter by meter, the ground that ignorance could no longer protect. Galileo and the Earth revolving around the sun, Darwin and the origin of species, geology and the age of the universe, neuroscience and the nature of consciousness. In each of these cases, the Church had built doctrine on a space of ignorance, on the assumption that nature, at that specific point, needed supernatural explanation. And in each case, when knowledge advanced sufficiently, the doctrine had to retreat. Spinoza anticipated this pattern 300 years before it became obvious. But the most devastating argument he constructed about miracles was not philosophical. It was historical. The miracles of the Old Testament, he noted, were almost exclusively performed in favor of Israel and against the enemies of Israel. The plagues of Egypt afflict the Egyptians. The sea opens for the Israelites and closes over the Egyptians. The sun stops in the sky so that Israel can finish a battle. Enemy armies are destroyed by angels, by diseases, by climatic phenomena. The God of the Old Testament is not a universal God who acts equally upon all peoples. He is a national God who actively favors a specific people and who uses the supernatural as an instrument of foreign policy for that people. This, Spinoza noted, is not the description of an infinite and universal God. It is the description of a tribal God, a divine being constructed in the image of the political needs of a specific nation at a specific historical moment to fulfill specific functions within the political structure of that nation. And when the Catholic Church adopted this same God and built a universal empire upon it, what it did was an extraordinary work of ideological engineering. It transformed a tribal God into a universal God, while carefully and selectively maintaining the control mechanisms that the tribal God had fulfilled. The God who favored Israel became the God who favored the Church. The miracles that legitimized Moses became the miracles that legitimized the saints and the popes. The law that Moses received at Sinai became the canon law that the Church's jurists had constructed over centuries. The Levitical priesthood became the Roman clergy. The synagogue became the cathedral. The structure was the same. Only the scale had changed, and the sophistication with which the control mechanisms were operated. Spinoza described one aspect of this mechanism with a precision that is almost admirable in its coldness: the role of fear in maintaining religious belief. In the preface to the Theological Political Treatise, he writes about how superstition arises from fear, how humans faced with uncertainty and the possibility of catastrophe seek signs, wonders, prophecies, how the powerful, throughout history, have learned to exploit this fear to ensure obedience, how religion in its institutionalized form is often less a system of spiritual quest than a system of fear management that produces fear of damnation, exclusion, divine punishment, and then sells the antidote, the sacraments, absolution, priestly mediation. It is a business model, Spinoza said. Not in those words, but with that clarity. And an extraordinarily efficient business model, because the product it sells, eternal salvation, cannot be verified by the consumer. There is no way to know if absolution worked until after death. There is no way to confirm if the sacraments truly channel divine grace. There is no way to audit spiritual accounts. What exists is faith, and faith, without the support of rational examination, is by definition vulnerable to manipulation. Not all faith. Spinoza made a careful distinction between genuine faith, the human disposition to open oneself to the experience of the divine, to act from love and reason, to perceive oneself as part of something greater, and the faith that religious institutions promoted. Unreflective submission to authority, fear as primary motivation, ignorance as virtue. The latter was not faith, it was voluntary servitude, and Spinoza, who had been born into a community of descendants of people who had lived as crypto-Jews for generations, who had apparently converted to Christianity to survive while secretly maintaining their true identity, knew better than almost any other philosopher of his time the price of voluntary servitude. He knew what happened to a people when sufficient external fear was applied for a sufficient time. He knew that human identity was not as solid as it seemed, that it could be shaped, bent, distorted by fear and the need to belong. That is why freedom, not as a political slogan but as an existential condition, was for him the central philosophical question. And that is why the Church, with all its intellectual sophistication, with its doctors and theologians and its immense tradition of thought, was for him fundamentally an obstacle to freedom. Not because it was composed of evil people. There were extraordinary individuals within the Church, and Spinoza corresponded with some of them, but because its structure, its institutional reason for being, depended on maintaining a condition of dependence among its faithful. A church whose members thought completely for themselves, who critically examined sacred texts, who refused to accept miracles as arguments of authority. That church would no longer be a church. It would simply be a community of thinking individuals sharing certain ethical values. And communities of thinking individuals do not pay tithes, do not build cathedrals, do not wage holy wars, and do not need intermediaries between themselves and the sacred. That was what Spinoza had revealed, and that is why the book was burned. There is a figure that the Church promoted as the second founder of Christianity, and that Spinoza, when examining his writings with the same rigor he had applied to the Old Testament, found to be much more ambiguous, much more human, and much more politically calculated than the official narrative allows. Paul of Tarsus was not a simple fisherman transformed by the love of Christ. He was a sophisticated intellectual, a Roman citizen, educated in one of the most important philosophical and theological traditions of his time, who perceived in Jesus, in the dead Jesus, in the resurrected Jesus in his own visionary experience, the possibility of building something that Judaism, by its ethnic and particular nature, could never build, a religion for all. This perception, which today may sound generous and inclusive, was at its essence an expansion project. First-century Judaism was a rigorous monotheistic religion with a detailed and demanding law, with specific rituals, with a strongly marked ethnic identity. For a Gentile to convert to complete Judaism, there were considerable obstacles: circumcision, Sabbath observance, dietary laws, and there was always beneath all of this the question of identity. Judaism was not just a religion, it was the way of being of a specific people. A Greek or a Roman who converted was accepted, but would never be completely a Jew in the same way as someone born into the tradition. Paul dissolved these obstacles with an elegant theology of enormous consequences. Salvation does not depend on the law, Paul said. It depends on faith in Christ. The law was given to Israel for a determined period. It was a pedagogue, a temporary guardian, that served to prepare the people for the arrival of the Messiah. But now that the Messiah has come and died for the sins of all, the law has been fulfilled in Christ and therefore no longer obliges. What matters is faith, the acceptance that Jesus died for you and rose again, and that because of this you are reconciled with God. Greek nor Jew, slave nor free, male nor female, all are one in Christ Jesus. This was revolutionary, and it was at the same time extraordinarily skillful from a political standpoint, because by dissolving the ethnic and legal boundaries that separated Jews from Gentiles, Paul created the space for a truly universal religion, a religion that could cross cultural boundaries much more easily than Judaism could, a religion that spoke to the universal fear of death, the universal desire for belonging, the universal need for meaning, regardless of where you were born or what language you spoke. And it grew with a speed that surprised even those who propagated it. But here is what Spinoza, following his method of historical analysis, would have observed, and what the critical scholars who came after him have extensively confirmed. Paul's theology is not necessarily the theology of Jesus. Paul's writings are the oldest in the New Testament, predating the Gospels by decades. The letters of Paul to the Romans, Corinthians, Galatians were written in the 50s of the Common Era, 20 years after Jesus' death, but still 40 years before Mark. And what we find in these letters is a theology centered on the death and resurrection of Christ that is surprisingly different from what the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, describe as the teaching of Jesus. The Jesus of the Synoptic Gospels preaches the kingdom of God, a Jewish eschatological concept about the transformation of the present order, the arrival of an era of justice, the defeat of the powers that oppress the poor. His teachings are primarily ethical. Blessed are the poor, the meek, the persecuted. The law must be fulfilled down to the smallest iota. He debates with Pharisees about the correct interpretation of the Jewish law, not about whether the law should be observed, but how. The Christ of Paul is different. He is not primarily an ethical teacher or a social reformer. He is a cosmic figure, the second person of a divine trinity, who descended to earth specifically to die as a sacrificial atonement for the sins of humanity, and whose death and resurrection are the only way to salvation. Two portraits of the same man, written note by people who never knew him personally. The evangelists did not either. Two portraits that emphasize completely different things, that answer completely different questions, that serve completely different purposes. Paul needed a universal Christ, a Christ that transcended Jewish particularity, a Christ that could be preached in Athens, in Corinth, in Rome, in the cosmopolitan metropolises of the Hellenistic world where he carried out his mission. He needed a Christ that made sense within the Greek philosophical categories of his audience, a divine logos, a mediating figure between the human and the transcendent. And he constructed this Christ, not out of nothing, not fraudulently, but through a creative and selective interpretation of memories, oral traditions, and personal mystical experiences that were absolutely real to him. This is what the Spinozist analysis reveals. Not that Paul lied, but that theology is always construction, always choice, always emphasis on certain elements over others, silence on certain aspects, dramatization of certain events, and these choices are never made in a vacuum. They are made within specific historical contexts, responding to specific needs, serving specific purposes. The Catholic Church chose Paul. This is not a controversial statement. It is practically the consensus of the history of Christian thought. The Theologia Catholicism is Pauline in its fundamental structure. The doctrine of original sin and redemption, the centrality of the sacraments as channels of grace, the priestly hierarchy as mediator between the faithful and the divine, the authority of the Church as interpreter of revelation. All of this has its theological foundations more in the thought of Paul, and in Paul's later elaborators, such as Augustine, than in the recorded words of Jesus. What Spinoza would have found disturbing, and which the method he established makes clearly visible, is the historical nature of this choice. The Church chose Paul not only because Paul was inspired by the Holy Spirit, but because Paul provided the necessary theological tools to build precisely the kind of institution that became the Catholic Church. The theology of redemption through faith in the dead and resurrected Christ placed the death of Jesus at the center of everything, and therefore placed the interpretation of that death at the center of everything. And who interpreted that death? The Church. Who administered access to the grace resulting from that death? The Church, through the sacraments, through the priests, through a hierarchical mediation structure, without which the individual believer could not directly access the divine. Compare this to what the Jesus of the Synoptic Gospels preached. The Lord's Prayer can be prayed directly, without intermediaries. The kingdom of God is within you. The last shall be first. God calls his people as a father calls his children, not as an emperor receives subjects. In this version of Jesus' teachings, there is no structural need for a mediating church. There is a radically direct, radically egalitarian spirituality, which, incidentally, disturbingly coincides with what Spinoza described as the true relationship between the human being and the divine. The church that was built, therefore, was the church of Paul, and of Paul's Paul, not the historical Paul, who was far more complex and contradictory than any institutionalization can capture. It was the church of the Paul interpreted by Augustine, by the Council of Nicaea, by Roman canon law, by the medieval papacy, a Paul carefully selected, edited, and amplified in aspects that served institutional construction. Once again, Spinoza didn't need to say this explicitly. His method spoke for itself. It's enough to apply to the history of the Christian canon the same principles he applied to the Old Testament. Ask who selected these texts, when, in what context, for what purpose, and what alternatives were discarded. The New Testament canon we know today did not exist in the first centuries of Christianity. There were dozens of Gospels, letters, and apocalypses circulating among Christian communities, texts that presented Jesus in radically different ways. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, contains sayings of Jesus that suggest a spirituality of individual seeking and direct knowledge, without hierarchical structure, without sacraments, without priestly mediation. There are Gospels in which Mary Magdalene is presented as Jesus' closest disciple, superior to Peter in spiritual understanding. There are texts that deny the physical resurrection. There are texts that deny the crucifixion. There is an entire universe of early Christology that did not survive, that was actively suppressed. Which texts survived and which texts were suppressed? Those that the official church, consolidated under the imperial patronage of Constantine and his successors, decided to canonize. The stated criterion for canonization was apostolicity. The texts had to have been written by the apostles or their direct disciples. But Spinoza had shown that this criterion was impossible to verify historically, and that it was itself suspect. The canonical Gospels were probably not written by the apostles whose names they bear. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were names attributed to anonymous texts decades after their composition. The real criterion, if viewed with historical honesty, was theological-political, the texts that reinforced the hierarchical structure of the Church, that centralized authority in the bishops and the Pope, that legitimized the priesthood as a necessary mediator. These were included. Those that suggested a more direct, more egalitarian spirituality, more independent of institutional mediation, were declared heretical and destroyed. That Jesus himself, if such a historical person existed, might have said things that fit better in the suppressed texts than in the canonized ones. This possibility was not a question the official church was willing to examine. Spinoza was, and what he found at the heart of it all was an institution that had built its authority not on the words of a founder, but on the careful selection of certain versions of those words, and on the violent suppression of all others. It was the same mechanism he had identified in the Old Testament. Testament, the power that perpetuates itself through control of the text. It defines the sacred, and therefore defines what can and cannot be thought, said, lived. The difference between the synagogue that had excommunicated Spinoza and the church that had placed the treatise on the index was one of scale, not of principle. Both were defending the same thing, the exclusive right to define reality, and Spinoza had affirmed with the geometric precision that was his trademark that this right did not belong to any institution, it belonged to reason. Rome, year 313 of the Common Era. Two rival emperors met in Milan to negotiate. Constantine controlled the west, Licinius controlled the east. Between them were disputed territories, armies in battle formation, and the fragmented body of the Roman Empire bleeding from dozens of simultaneous wounds. What emerged from this meeting was the Edict of Milan, a document that granted religious tolerance to all citizens of the empire, including Christians. It was not a conversion of Rome to Christianity. It was a pragmatic political decision. In a multi-religious empire in crisis, persecuting any group was a cost without a clear benefit. But Constantine went beyond tolerance. In the following decades, he transferred imperial resources to the church, built basilicas in Jerusalem and Rome, granted tax exemptions to the clergy, and, the most consequential act of all, convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 to resolve the theological disputes that were fragmenting the Christian movement. Why would a Roman emperor be deeply interested enough in the internal theological disputes of a religion to convene an ecumenical council, preside over the debates, and ensure that a specific position emerged victorious? The obvious answer, that Constantine was a sincere Christian deeply committed to the doctrinal integrity of the faith, collapses under basic historical examination. Constantine was baptized only on his deathbed in 337, after a political life of compromises, accommodations, and violence that would be difficult to reconcile with the teachings that Jesus had recorded in the Gospels. His personal god of devotion, before and after his conversion, seems to have been Sol Invictus, the unconquerable sun, the solar deity that had been promoted by his predecessor Aurelian as a symbol of imperial unity. It is difficult not to notice that the iconography of the halo around the heads of Christian saints, that golden aureole that we now immediately associate with the sacred, is Roman solar iconography, transported directly into Christian art. The most honest answer, and the one most consistent with Spinoza's analysis, is that Constantine recognized in institutional Christianity something that Roman paganism, with its democratic pantheon of competing gods, could not offer: the possibility of a unifying ideology. A cosmology that placed imperial authority within a divine framework, not as one among many gods, but as a representative of the one true God on earth. Caesaropapism, the fusion of imperial and religious authority, was not invented by Constantine. It was a very ancient tradition in the Near East. The Egyptian pharaohs were gods, the kings of Mesopotamia were representatives of the gods. Augustus himself had accepted religious titles, and Roman emperors were deified after death. But Christian monotheism offered something that polytheism could not: singularity. One God, one empire, one emperor representing that God on earth. The geometry of power was much cleaner. What Constantine did, therefore, can be understood as an operation of ideological engineering of extraordinary genius. He took a peripheral religious movement, which had grown among the poor and oppressed of the empire, which preached equality and detachment from worldly power, and transformed it into an instrument of imperial consolidation. For this, the movement needed to be doctrinally unified. The theological diversity that had existed in the first 2 centuries of Christianity, this proliferation of gospels, of Christologies, of interpretations, was functionally useless for a project of ideological unification. Our God, who could be interpreted in 100 different ways, did not unify anyone. Nicaea was the solution. At the Council of Nicaea, 318 bishops from across the Christian world debated, among other things, the Arian question. Arius, an Alexandrian theologian, argued that the Son was a creature of God, supreme but created and therefore subordinate to the Father. Athanasius, his adversary, argued that the Son was of the same substance as the Father, co-eternal, co-equal, truly God as the Father was God. The difference may seem abstract, but it had immediate political consequences. A Christ who is less than the Father is ultimately an intermediary, someone between humans and God, certainly superior, but still of the same nature, derived. Our Christ, who is of the same substance as the Father, is God in person, absolute, final, irrefutable. And if Christ is absolutely God, then the Church that speaks in the name of Christ speaks in the name of absolute God. Not of one God among many, not of a regional or tribal deity, of the one God of the entire universe. The authority this confers is impossible to overstate. Constantine ensured that Athanasius's position prevailed, not necessarily because he had an informed theological opinion on homoousios, but because Athanasius's theology produced a more absolute religious authority, and a more absolute religious authority was more useful politically. Arius was excommunicated. His writings were ordered burned, a practice the Church would maintain for centuries, and which Spinoza saw applied to his own book. Bishops who refused to sign the Nicene Creed were exiled. Doctrinal unification was secured by imperial force, not by theological argument. This is what Spinoza's method revealed when applied not only to texts, but also to the institutional history of the Church, that the councils that defined Christian doctrine were not assemblies of theologians arriving at truth through free debate. They were political operations presided over by imperial power, where the outcome was determined not by the quality of the arguments, but by the distribution of power among the participants. The doctrine of the Trinity, the dogmatic heart of Catholicism, the affirmation that God is one in three persons, did not emerge naturally from the writings of the New Testament. It was defined, clarified, and made obligatory through a process of debate, conflict, exile, and imperial imposition that lasted for decades after Nicaea. The word Trinity does not appear in the Bible. This is a fact that Catholic theologians themselves admit, and which they explain by saying that the concept is implicit in the Scriptures, even if the word is not. But Spinoza would have observed that an implicit concept that only becomes explicit through centuries of human debate, and that is only defined in its final form through councils presided over by emperors, is exactly the kind of concept one would expect from a progressive human construction, not from an immediate and unequivocal divine revelation. But what came after Constantine was even more revealing. Because the project that Constantine had initiated, the fusion of imperial power and religious authority, had within it a tension that would inevitably explode. Who, in fact, held supreme authority? The emperor who convened councils and guaranteed results, or the Church which possessed the keys to paradise and the power to declare anyone, including emperors, excommunicated? This tension defined European politics for a millennium. In the East, in the Byzantine Empire, the emperor maintained predominance over the Church, a model that scholars call Caesaropapism. The Patriarch of Constantinople was a powerful figure, but ultimately subordinate to the emperor. In the West, where the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, and no secular power was strong enough to completely dominate the Church, the papacy gradually built a position of authority that not only equaled imperial power, but surpassed it. The decisive moment came with Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV in 1076. Henry IV had appointed bishops to positions in Germany, a practice called lay investiture, which the popes had tolerated for generations, but which Gregory VII decided to attack as a usurpation of ecclesiastical authority. The conflict escalated until Gregory excommunicated Henry, declaring the emperor outside the Church and therefore releasing his subjects from their oath of obedience. This was not merely a spiritual declaration. It was a devastating political weapon in a world where the legitimacy of power depended on ecclesiastical approval. The German princes, happy to have a pretext to rebel against the emperor, threatened to abandon him. Henry IV was forced to go to Canossa, a castle in the Apennines where Gregory VII was staying, and spend 3 days barefoot in the snow, waiting for the Pope to receive him and lift the excommunication. The Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, the heir to Rome, to Augustus and Constantine, waiting on his knees in the snow for a bishop from central Italy to restore his right to rule. It was a scene that said everything about what the Church had built up over the centuries since Constantine. Spinoza, upon reading the history of this episode and applying to it the principles he had developed, would see not a triumph of spirituality over worldly power, but the most sophisticated mechanism of worldly power that history had produced. Power disguised as renunciation of power, authority presented as service, control exercised in the name of liberation. Because the medieval papacy was not, in any substantive sense, a spiritual institution. It was a political institution that secondarily exercised political power. It used spiritual language to exert power over all others. It had territory, it had armies, it had a continent-wide administrative bureaucracy. It collected taxes, the tithes that flowed from all over Christian Europe to Rome. It controlled education through monasteries and universities founded by the Church. It controlled marriage, and therefore succession and inheritance. It controlled the registration of births and deaths. It controlled what could be read through indexes of prohibited books. And above all, it controlled the interpretation of reality. What was true and what was heresy, what was virtuous and what was sin, who was saved and who was condemned. This control of the interpretation of reality is what Spinoza had identified as the core of everything, because whoever controls the interpretation of reality controls people's behavior in a way that no physical force can completely replicate. You can subdue a people with armies, but you need many soldiers, and soldiers are expensive, and subjugated peoples rebel when they can. You can subjugate a people with the interpretation of reality, convincing them that the current order is divine, that obedience is virtue, that rebellion is sin. Then you don't need so many soldiers because people control themselves. This is what Michel Foucault, 4 centuries after Spinoza, would call biopower, power that doesn't function primarily through external coercion, but through the internalization of norms, power that makes people want what power wants them to want. The medieval Catholic Church was the greatest biopower machine the Western world has ever known, and Spinoza had described its fundamental mechanism with a clarity that no one before him had achieved. It worked by convincing people that a text written by men was the Word of God, and therefore that the institution that interpreted that text spoke with the authority of God, and therefore that questioning that institution was questioning God. It was a perfect loop, and to undo it a single gesture was enough: to examine the text. On October 31st, 1517, an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther, according to tradition that may or may not correspond exactly to what occurred, nailed 95 theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. The theses attacked the practice of indulgences, the sale of papal pardons that promised to reduce the time of punishment in purgatory for the buyers or their deceased relatives. It was a practice that the papacy had developed with increasing sophistication over the centuries, and which had become one of the Church's main sources of revenue, especially when Johann Tetzel toured Germany, announcing that, for every coin that fell into the box, a soul would leave purgatory. The sale of salvation, literally. Luther was not, at this initial moment, attacking the fundamental structure of the Church. He was attacking a specific abuse within that structure. His stated intention was to reform, not to destroy. But Spinoza, in analyzing what the Protestant Reformation truly was and what it truly did, would arrive at a disturbing conclusion: that the Reformation changed the administrator without changing the mechanism. It replaced one system of control with another. It exchanged the authority of the Pope for the authority of Scripture, and in doing so, it preserved intact the fundamental principle that had generated the problem from the beginning. Because what the Reformation affirmed in its most radical version was, the Bible and only the Bible is the final authority in matters of faith. Sola Scriptura, Scripture alone. Not tradition, not the Pope, not councils, only the biblical text read directly by the faithful. At first glance, this seems like a radical democratization of faith, and in certain aspects it was: the translation of the Bible into vernacular languages, the literacy promoted by the Reformers so that people could read the text for themselves, the elimination of the priest as a mandatory intermediary in the reading of the Scriptures. But Sola Scriptura contained an insoluble contradiction that Spinoza had already identified in his analysis. If the biblical text is the final authority, and if the biblical text was written by human beings with specific historical interests and perspectives, and if the biblical text contains internal contradictions that need to be resolved by some interpretation, then the question of power does not disappear. It merely shifts. Before, interpretative authority belonged to the Pope. Afterward, it belonged to Luther, or Calvin, or Zwingli, each with their own version of how the text should be read, each excommunicating the others as heretics when interpretations diverged. Authority was not eliminated, it was fragmented, and fragmentation produced something that unified Catholicism had managed to avoid for centuries: religious war. This was done, as Spinoza had shown step by step, not by theological accident, but by political necessity. Because a religion that does not require institutional mediation cannot be administered by an institution. A spirituality based on love and reason does not produce centralized power. An ethic that anyone can live by without intermediaries does not need priests. The institutionalization of Christianity had created a structure that, in order to survive, needed to keep people in a state of permanent spiritual dependence. And it had developed over centuries extraordinarily sophisticated instruments to guarantee this dependence. Original sin, which made human nature fundamentally flawed and in need of redemption. Purgatory, which extended the system of punishment and reward beyond death. The sacraments, which made a priest necessary at every critical moment of human life, from baptism to marriage to extreme unction. Birth needs a priest. Maturity needs a priest. Marriage needs a priest. Sin needs a priest for absolution. Death needs a priest for the last rites. From cradle to grave, human life was surrounded by the sacraments and the clergy who administered them. There was no room for the divine to happen outside this structure. There was no way to reach God without going through the church. It was total control. And it was, as Spinoza had shown, built upon the text, upon the specific, selective, and politically motivated reading of historical documents that had been presented as the Word of God. But here is the dimension that goes beyond the historical diagnosis and enters into what Spinoza had most original to say. It is not enough to show that the Church built its power on a false foundation. That is enough to deconstruct, but not to build. The question that Spinoza raised with each page of the treatise, and which he would develop more extensively in the Ethics, the masterpiece that would only be published posthumously, was if not the Church, what? If not the Bible as irrefutable authority, what? If not the fear of damnation as motivation for ethics, what? The answer he built throughout his life was freedom. Not freedom in the trivialized modern sense, the freedom to do what you want, to satisfy desires, to act without restrictions, but freedom in the deepest sense that philosophy had hitherto achieved, the freedom to understand, the freedom to comprehend the causal processes that determine you, that determine society, that determine nature, and to act from that understanding, instead of from ignorance, fear, or blind obedience to authorities who proclaimed themselves divine, but were, as he had shown, entirely human. This freedom did not destroy ethics, it founded it. Because the person who truly understands, who understands that their happiness is linked to the happiness of others, that the reason that dwells within them is the same reason that permeates the universe, that to act unjustly is to act against nature itself. That person acts ethically not out of fear of hell, but because they understand what they are. And there lies the abysmal difference between Spinoza and all his ecclesiastical detractors. They believed that without the fear of divine punishment, human beings would plunge into moral chaos. Spinoza believed that fear had never produced genuine virtue. It had only produced obedience. And obedience without understanding is, at any moment when vigilance relaxes, simply the absence of virtuous behavior. True virtue was the daughter of freedom, not fear. And true freedom was the daughter of knowledge, of the honest examination of reality, including the texts that institutions had declared untouchable, including the Bible, including 2 millennia of church history, including, finally, everything that organized religion had built, not with God but in the name of God, with entirely human hands for entirely human ends, with a mixture of genuine greatness and calculated control that Spinoza was the first to describe with sufficient precision that it could never again be completely forgotten. He died in 1677 at the age of 44. The glass dust had done its work. He left few belongings, some books and a body of work that the world would take centuries to fully absorb. But he also left something more difficult to measure: the method, the philosophical permission to examine what had been declared unexaminable, the demonstration that reverence and rigor are not incompatible, that the most serious thing a human being can do before the divine is to refuse to accept human substitutes in its place. This, in the end, was what Spinoza had revealed about the origin of the Catholic religion. Not that it was evil, Not that all those who built it were calculating cynics, but that it was human entirely, irreducibly. Human existence, and the pretense of not being human was the greatest and most consequential of his fictions. There is an accusation that haunted Spinoza throughout his life and continues to be repeated to this day by those who have not read his work carefully, that he was an atheist. He was not. Atheism presupposes the denial of God. Spinoza never denied God. What he did was something that the theologians of his time found even more disturbing than denial. He redefined God in a way that made religious institutions unnecessary. Deus sive natura. God, that is, nature. Not a God who created nature from the outside and then governs it from afar, occasionally intervening with miracles when it suits him, but a God who is nature, who expresses himself in every physical law, in every movement of the planets, in every human thought, in every leaf that falls from a tree in autumn. For Spinoza, God was not above reality. He was reality, the totality of what exists, seen in its deepest unity. This was pantheism, a word that the Irish philosopher John Toland would coin decades later, specifically to describe Spinoza's position. And it was, for the Church, literally inconceivable as genuine theology, because a God who is identical to nature cannot be separated from it, cannot be in one place more than another, cannot prefer one nation or one church over another, cannot reveal his will through texts written by priests. Such a God needs no intermediaries. He needs no Mass, no confession, no absolution, no pope, no synod, no any of the structures the Church had built to mediate human access to the divine. All of nature is sacred. Human reason that understands this nature is already in itself a form of contact with the divine. Clear and honest thought is already a form of prayer, not addressed to a separate being, but participating in the order that permeates everything. This liberated humankind in a way that the Church could never accept. Because if you can find the divine in nature, in thought, in ethics lived with integrity, then you need nothing more. You don't need any institution between you and the sacred. You don't need any text declared infallible. You don't need any hierarchy that defines what you can or cannot think, and a humanity that doesn't need intermediaries between itself and the divine is a humanity that cannot be controlled through religion. Spinoza knew this. His enemies knew it too. That's why the banishment. That's why the bonfires where his books burned. That's why the systematic effort to silence him. Not because he had denied God, but because he had found a God so great that no human institution could fit within him. To understand what Spinoza revealed about the origin of Catholicism, it is necessary to understand a specific mechanism that the Church perfected over centuries, and which is perhaps its most lasting contribution to the architecture of human power, the creation of an unpayable debt. Original sin is not a minor theological doctrine, it is the foundation of everything. Adam and Eve disobeyed God. This disobedience corrupted human nature at its root. All human beings are therefore born carrying a guilt that they did not personally incur, but inherited biologically, spiritually, ontologically. They are born with a structural flaw. They are born needing redemption. Spinoza examined this doctrine with his usual method, not as a theologian who needs to defend or attack it, but as a historian of ideas who asks, where does this come from? What does it do? Whom does it serve? The Genesis text describing the fall of Adam and Eve does not contain the doctrine of original sin as the Church developed it. The original Hebrew text makes no mention of the hereditary transmission of guilt. In Rabbinic Judaism, the story of the Garden of Eden is interpreted in various ways, none of them as the establishment of a cosmic guilt genetically transmitted to all humanity. This specific interpretation was developed by Paul in his letters to the Romans and later systematized by Augustine of Hippo in the 4th and 5th centuries in the context of a polemic against Pelagius, a British monk who argued that human beings had sufficient free will to choose good without the need for divine grace. Augustine won the debate. Pelagius was declared a heretic, and with Augustine's victory, All of humanity was declared fundamentally corrupt, incapable by its own means of doing good or achieving salvation, absolutely dependent on God's grace, and God's grace, in the system the Church built upon this theology, was administered by the sacraments which were administered by the clergy. See the perfect geometry of control. You are born with a debt. You did not incur this debt personally. You cannot pay it with your own strength, because nature itself, which you would use to pay it, is not the very thing you would use to do so. Human nature is corrupted by debt. The only way out of debt is through divine grace. And divine grace comes primarily through the sacraments, and the sacraments are administered by the Church. Without the Church, you are condemned. It's the most efficient business model that ever existed. Create the disease and sell the cure. Declare human nature flawed and offer exclusively the cure for that flaw. Spinoza rejected this logic at its root. Human nature was not corrupted. It was what it was, with its passions, its fears, its capabilities, and its limitations. And the work of philosophy was not to lament this nature, but to understand it. To understand it so completely that it would be possible to act from reason instead of being dragged along by passions. Not by divine grace administered by an institution, but by gradually acquired personal understanding. This transferred ethical responsibility entirely to the individual. No church could save him. No sacrament could replace the work of knowing oneself and the world honestly. It was liberating and terrifying at the same time. And it is terrifying precisely for those who had built their power on the unpayable debt that Spinoza simply refused to acknowledge. To measure the scale of what Spinoza revealed, one must look at the most revealing instrument the Church created to defend its authority, the Inquisition. Not the Inquisition as a fantasy of torture chambers, although torture was used and abundantly documented, but the Inquisition as an intellectual system, as an architecture of thought control. The Inquisition was created in the 13th century, primarily to deal with the Cathars in southern France, a Christian movement that rejected the church hierarchy, the wealth of the clergy, the sacraments, and papal authority. The Cathars were not violent. They were, by most historical accounts, people of austere and genuinely serious spiritual lives. They were extinguished, militarily by the Albigensian Crusade, and then judicially by the Inquisition. The problem the Cathars represented was not spiritual, it was political. They demonstrated by their existence that it was possible to have an intense religious life completely outside the structure of the Catholic Church. If that were possible, then the Church was not necessary. And if the Church was not necessary, the entire edifice of authority built upon that necessity was crumbling. The Inquisition was, in its essence, a tribunal to punish the unnecessary. To punish the demonstration, whether by word or by example of life, that human beings could relate to the divine without the mediation of the Church. Spinoza, when historically examining the institution of the Inquisition, found confirmed every hypothesis he had developed about the nature of organized religious power. What the inquisitors pursued were not, for the most part, people of dubious morality. They were often people of exemplary lives, whose only crime was thinking differently from the orthodox, or living in a way that demonstrated that the Church was not necessary to live with integrity. The list of crimes that the Inquisition punished is revealing. Heresy, that is, believing the wrong things about God. Blasphemy, that is, speaking of sacred things in an unauthorized manner. Witchcraft and sorcery, that is, claiming access to the supernatural outside ecclesiastical channels. Bigamy, for violating the sacredness of marriage administered by the Church. Sodomy, for violating the sexual norm that the Church had defined as natural. Judaizing, that is, practicing elements of the Jewish faith even if secretly. This last item is particularly relevant for understanding the history of Spinoza and his community. The Jews forcibly converted in Spain, the so-called conversos or, pejoratively Marranos, were persecuted by the Inquisition for any sign that they maintained private Jewish practices. External conversion was not enough. The Church wanted the interior. It wanted the thought. It wanted the deeper identity. This is biopower in its purest and most violent form, the claim to control not only behavior but belief, not only action but consciousness. And here is the paradox that Spinoza articulated precisely. The attempt to control thought by force is fundamentally self-destructive, because forced thought is not genuine thought. Faith obtained through the threat of torture is not faith, it is performance. And an institution that builds its authority on performances of faith is building on sand. He stated this explicitly in the Theological Political Treatise. The human mind cannot be commanded. The state can control bodies, can punish actions, can regulate external behaviors. But it cannot decree what people believe. It can only create hypocrisy. It can only produce a population that says one thing and thinks another. And hypocrisy on a civilizational scale is exactly what the Inquisition had produced. An entire Europe in which people learned to completely separate what they said in public from what they thought in private, where the life of the mind had become a secret life, hidden by the necessity of survival beneath a layer of external conformity, where genuine thought, when it existed, was clandestine by definition. The liberation of this schism between mind and word was, for Spinoza, the most urgent task that philosophy faced, not as an immediate political project. He was too clear-eyed about the limitations of his time to believe that the system would crumble during his lifetime, but as a long-term project, patiently realized, one mind at a time. As more people gained access to the tools of critical thinking, the book was the instrument. That is why they burned it. In 1677, a few months after Spinoza's death, his friends posthumously published his most ambitious work. The Ethics, Ethica Ordine Geometrico Demonstrata, Ethics Demonstrated in Geometric Order, was a book both fascinating and intimidating in its form. Spinoza had structured the entire work as a geometric system: definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, corollaries, like Euclid, but about God, the human mind, and the nature of happiness. It was a statement of method before it was a statement of content. The truths about God, about humanity, about ethics could be demonstrated with the same logical necessity with which the truths of geometry were demonstrated. They did not need revelation. They did not need authority. They needed reason and a willingness to follow the argument wherever it led, even if it led to uncomfortable places. What the ethics built step by step was a system in which God and nature were identical, a single infinite substance expressing itself in infinite modes, of which the physical world and the mental world were two attributes that the human mind could comprehend. Human beings, in this system, were not separate creatures from God, looking from the outside at a universe created by an external intelligence. They were modes of God, temporary and particular expressions of the infinite substance. Their minds were, literally, parts of God's infinite thought. Their bodies were parts of God's infinite extension. This had a fundamental ethical consequence. If you are part of God, if the reason in you is God's reason operating in a specific mode, then acting against reason is not just a bad decision. It is a form of self-contradiction. It is God acting against himself in a particular fragment of his expression, and acting with reason, clearly understanding your situation, acting from understanding rather than blind passions, finding your happiness not in transient pleasures, but in the understanding of eternal order, is the closest a finite being can come to fully participating in the infinite nature of God. This is Spinoza's salvation, not paradise after death, not future reward for present obedience, but beatitudo, the blessedness that is the very state of clearly understanding, of acting freely, of perceiving oneself as part of something that transcends individual limitation without dissolving individuality. There was no place for the Church in this system. There was no place for sacraments, nor for priestly mediation, nor for revealed texts as final authority. There was room for a community of people seeking understanding together, but this community did not need hierarchy, did not need dogma, did not need mechanisms of exclusion. It was radical in the most literal sense. It went to the root. And the root that Spinoza reached was this: every system of power that relies on human ignorance is, by definition, provisional. As knowledge advances, the foundation corrodes. As more people gain access to the tools of critical thinking, the authority based on claims of irrefutability, loses ground. This does not mean that religion disappears. Spinoza did not assert that, and history would not confirm it. The dimension of the sacred, the experience of the numinous, the search for meaning that transcends the individual, these are deep human needs that no rationalist philosophy completely eliminates. What Spinoza asserted was something more precise, that the institutions that monopolized these needs and turned them into instruments of political control had built on foundations that would not withstand honest examination. And he was right. In the 2 centuries following Spinoza's death, something happened in European culture that confirms, point by point, the diagnosis he had made. Historical biblical criticism, the systematic application to the biblical text of the method Spinoza had established, produced in the 19th century an intellectual revolution of proportions comparable to what Copernicus had done with astronomy. Julius Wellhausen demonstrated that the Pentateuch was the compilation of 4 distinct documentary sources, written at different times, with different theologies, editorially stitched together by later redactors, confirming with decades of detailed philological work what Spinoza had intuited from his careful reading of the text. David Strauss published in 1835 his Life of Jesus, treating the Gospels as mythical and historical documents, not as literal reports of supernatural events. The scandal was immense. Strauss lost his position, was academically ostracized, and spent the rest of his life on the margins. But the argument could not be refuted, only suppressed. Ernest Renan wrote in 1863 another Life of Jesus, this time a purely human Jesus, son of his time and culture, understood within the Judaism of the 1st century without resorting to any supernatural category. The book was a scandalous public success and a catastrophe for Renan within the French Church. Throughout the 20th century, the so-called historical critical school became the dominant method in academic biblical studies, including in Catholic universities. The distance between what theologians know and what parishes teach the faithful is, to this day, an abyss that the Church has not found a satisfactory way to cross. Spinoza had predicted this. He had predicted that the advance of historical knowledge would make the claim of divine authority of the texts increasingly unsustainable. He had predicted that institutions would try to contain this advance and that they would not succeed completely. He had predicted that the result would be a long and painful renegotiation between what religion asserts and what knowledge demonstrates. But there is a dimension of Spinoza's legacy that goes beyond intellectual history and enters contemporary politics in a way that he himself may not have fully anticipated. The separation between church and state, the principle that most democratic countries adopt as the foundation of political organization, has in Spinoza one of its most profound architects. The Theological Political Treatise was, in its declared intention, an argument for freedom of thought and for the separation between religious authority and political authority. Spinoza did not argue that religion should be eliminated from public life. He argued that the state should not be an instrument of any religion, and that no religion should use the state as an arm of coercion. In a context where Europe had just destroyed a third of its population in a war of religion, this argument was urgent beyond philosophy. It was a matter of civilizational survival. The idea that citizens can have different religious beliefs without that affecting their citizenship, that the state is not the arbiter of theological truths, that individual conscience has a sphere of sovereignty that public power cannot invade. These ideas that today seem obvious to us were radical and dangerous in the 17th century, and Spinoza was one of the first to articulate them with sufficient philosophical rigor for them to become the foundation of a political project and not just a personal position. Locke read Spinoza and publicly denied having done so because being identified as Spinozist was politically suicidal. The influence is there, traceable by any historian of ideas who examines it honestly. Jefferson, when drafting the founding documents of the United States, was operating within a tradition of political thought that Spinoza had helped to build. French secularism, English religious tolerance, modern democratic pluralism, all draw from a source that includes, among its deepest springs, the cold attic in Amsterdam where a lens grinder wrote the most dangerous book of his century. And the Catholic Church, the institution that had placed this book on the index in 1679 and only removed it in 1900, had to adapt to a world progressively shaped by the principles that Spinoza had pioneeringly articulated. The Second Vatican Council in 1965 formally recognized religious freedom as a fundamental human right. Our 20th century Pope declaring as universal truth what an excommunicated Jew had asserted in the 17th century, for which he had been banished, his books burned, his memory slandered for generations. History has enough irony for everyone. But what remains, what cannot be resolved by institutional adaptation, is the question that Spinoza left unanswered, not because he did not know how to answer it, but because the answer belongs to each individual human being. If authority does not come from texts, nor from institutions, nor from tradition, if the foundation of ethics is reason and the foundation of the sacred is the whole of nature, then what to do with the loneliness of that freedom? Because the freedom that Spinoza proposed was also a form of loneliness. Without the cozy community of shared certainty, without the comfort of authority that tells what is right and what is wrong, without the promise of paradise as a reward for present suffering, the human being stands before themselves and the universe without intermediary. Spinoza thought this was liberating, that the beatitude born of genuine understanding was a deeper and more stable happiness than any comfort provided by illusion. Perhaps, but it is a happiness that requires courage. The courage to look at what is without distorting it into what one would like it to be. The courage to live without imposed certainties from the outside. The courage that Spinoza himself demonstrated, with excommunication, with isolation, with lungs destroyed by glass dust, with 44 years of life and a work that the world would take centuries to absorb. The courage to be free. There is a type of truth that once seen cannot be unseen. Not because it is irrefutable in the technical sense, philosophers will continue to debate Spinoza as long as there are philosophers, but because it changes the angle of vision in a permanent way. Because after understanding what he understood, you read a sacred text differently, hear a sermon differently, observe the architecture of any institution that claims authority over the divine in a way that you can no longer ignore certain patterns. This is not necessarily destructive. It can be. For those who built their entire lives on certainties that examination dissolves, the process can be painful, but it doesn't have to be. Because what Spinoza revealed about the origin of the Catholic religion, about how texts were written by men, compiled by men, selected by men, interpreted by men, used by men to build systems of authority that benefited specific men in specific historical contexts, this diagnosis does not eliminate the sacred. It only eliminates the intermediaries that place themselves between you and the sacred. And here is the point that may be the hardest to absorb, but also the most important. Spinoza was, in his own way, deeply religious, more deeply than many of his persecutors. His devotion to understanding, his refusal to accept easy answers, his willingness to live on the absolute margins of society rather than capitulate to the pressure to say what he did not believe. This has the profile of serious spirituality that seeks not comfort, but truth, and that accepts the cost of it. When he wrote about God, he was not using metaphors. He was describing what he genuinely found when he looked closely enough at the order of the universe. A coherence that astonished him, a necessity that moved him, a fullness that exceeded any concept he could formulate about it. The difference was that he did not call it priest, nor pope, nor sacred text, nor sacraments. He called it nature, reason, infinite substance that expresses itself in infinite modes, and of which every human being who thinks honestly is an expression. And perhaps that is the deepest legacy of what he revealed. Not the destruction of the possibility of the sacred, but its liberation from all the human cages that imprisoned it. The question that remains, the question that each generation needs to answer for itself, is what to do with this freedom. The freedom to seek the divine without mandatory intermediaries. The freedom to build an ethics based on understanding rather than fear. The freedom to read any text, sacred or not, with the open eyes of someone who knows it was written by human hands and is therefore capable of containing wisdom. Spinoza paid the highest price that a human being can pay for an idea. Not death, but isolation. The denied community, the belonging taken away. Decades alone with his books and his lenses and his correspondence, on the margins of a world that was not ready for what he had seen. And yet, something extraordinary happened at the end of his life that may be the best answer to the question of whether all that was worth it. In the last weeks before he died, in February 1677, Spinoza continued to receive visitors. Philosophers, curious individuals, students who made long journeys to sit for a few hours with that small and sick man who had thought deeper than anyone of his generation. One of them asked what he always asked, if he had found peace. The answer that historical accounts preserve, with variations in formulation but consistency in content, was this: he had found the peace that comes from understanding, not the peace of certainty, the peace of understanding, the peace of someone who no longer needs illusions to endure reality, because reality seen with sufficient clarity is itself sufficient. Sub specie eternitatis, under the perspective of eternity. It was the formula he had developed to describe the way of seeing that philosophy made possible, not the escape from time and limitation, but the ability to see one's own particular life within the infinite context of which it is a part, to perceive that what you are, this temporary and specific mode of infinite substance, is real, is necessary, is part of something that does not begin or end with you. This vision does not eliminate pain. It does not eliminate death, nor loneliness, nor the glass dust in the lungs. But it places all of this within a proportion that makes it bearable, and more than bearable. It makes it, in a certain way, sacred. The religion that the Church had built promised the peace of paradise after death, in exchange for obedience during life. Spinoza proposed something different, the peace of understanding during life, without the promise of anything beyond, and without the need for anything beyond. It was a more demanding proposal. There was no crutch of future reward. There was no personal God who listened to prayers and interceded. There was only the universe, immense, indifferent in the sense that it does not favor. No specific individual, but extraordinarily ordered, extraordinarily coherent, extraordinarily real. And there was the human mind, capable, when exercised with honesty and rigor, of understanding a fraction of this universe. And this understanding, no matter how small, was already participation. It was already contact with what Spinoza called the divine. This was what he revealed about the origin of the Catholic religion. Not only that it was built by men, this, in itself, would be a historical argument, valuable but limited, but that the divine it aimed to represent was too real, too immense, to fit within the structure that had been built in its name, that the frame, no matter how gilded, was not the picture, and that the picture, the naked divine without institution and without intermediary, present in the order of the universe and in the human capacity to understand that order, was there all the time. It had been there before Rome, before Constantine, before the Council of Nicaea, before Paul, before Jesus, before Moses. It was there when Spinoza lit the candle and began to write, and it is here now at this very moment, while you think about all this. It did not need any church to reach you. It never needed to.